Welcome back, second graders. This is the last little section of Appleseed Farm by Emily Taft Douglas. I'm Mrs. Frank, and I'll be reading part 3, which jumps back to Penny from the beginning of the story, if you can remember. It's called Penny Again. Aunt Millie settled back on the bench. Is that all? Penny asked. She had been sitting still a long time, and suddenly she noticed that there were prickles in her legs. Aunt Millie hesitated. It's all of the story about Johnny Appleseed, she said. She handed her cup to Penny for a last drink. Penny scrambled over to the spring. As she stooped down just for a moment, she fancied she saw the reflection of a little girl in a coverall apron. Behind her knelt an old man scooping up water in his hands. Penny smiled. After today, her thoughts would always share the spring with those two who had loved it 100 years ago. And here's the sketch for this last chapter, and it says, Penny thought of the others who had loved the spring. As for it being all of the story, Aunt Millie was saying, I don't know, I'm sure. I used to beg my grandmother, who had been that little girl, Ada Bartlett, to tell it over and over again. I almost lived her adventures. I loved Johnny Appleseed as though I had known him. But best of all, I felt that I was going right on with the story. I was a Bartlett, and I had to carry out my part of the family promise. That's why you give so many apples away, Penny exclaimed, and make jelly for the old people who don't have orchards. You're still paying the debt. Suddenly she frowned. But Dad is a Bartlett too, and he doesn't pay the debt. He pays it better than any of us, Aunt Millie answered indignantly. Trying to make one world with peace for all is just what Johnny Appleseed would have wanted. Each of us has to work in his own way, she went on. I'm on the farm, and so I still pick the apples. But the story keeps going on. I pass it along to you. Maybe you can go on with it from here. Aunt Millie stood up. My goodness, she said. I've talked till nearly noon. Your grandfather will be starved. Wait a minute, Penny begged, catching hold of her aunt's hand. I have a million questions to ask you. But when Aunt Millie waited, Penny could think of only one. Holding up the small black seed, she asked, Is this the great-great-grandchild of Ada's Appleseeds? Aunt Millie laughed. Yes, or at least it's a descendant. There aren't many of the old trees left, but our new orchard, she waved in that direction, was started with cuttings from the old one. So you see how Johnny Appleseed's gift outlived even the life of an orchard. Penny looked at the little seed that she had nearly flipped away. I'm keeping this for my memory book, she said. I'll give you something better, Aunt Millie promised. I'll give you the little deerskin bag that Ada seeds came in. Oh, Aunt Millie, gasped Penny, do you still have it? Yes, it's in a trunk in the attic. I've treasured it all these years. It helped me carry on the story. When I had troubles, or thought I did, it reminded me of its first owner and what he said. Now I really must go and fix dinner. Mind that you're washed and ready to eat in half an hour. Penny got herself a drink from the spring, then curled up on the bench again. She was thinking. She understood better now why Aunt Millie made jelly for the other people and why she gave her apples to the neighbors. Even Aunt Millie's big apron and her rough red hands grew suddenly dear. They were so useful. Aunt Millie, Penny shouted in sudden approval, I love everything about you. Aunt Millie could not hear Penny's words, but she stopped to wave before she hurried into the house. Penny smiled to herself. People were the same today as they were 100 years ago, she decided. Some folks thought Johnny Appleseed was foolish because he did things for others instead of just for himself. She had even thought the same about Grandfather and Aunt Millie. Now she understood them better. That night, when Penny went to her room, she thought again about her parents. Of course, their work in New York was important. They were trying to make one world out of different nations. But now Penny knew that a big city was not the only place where important things happened, and that important things had not just begun to happen. First, there must be people like Ada and Ned and Johnny Appleseed. They had helped to make a nation out of a wilderness. Then Grandfather and Aunt Millie, they were important too. They were passing on good things and being good neighbors. Suddenly, Penny noticed something on her pillow. "Oh my, oh jumping Jonah," she cried in the words of her Uncle Ned, for there, lying on the fresh white pillowcase, was the very same little deerskin bag which Johnny Appleseed had given to Ada. Penny picked it up and turned it over and over in her hands. Then she pinned the little bag onto her nightgown and snuggled down in her bed. All at once, it seemed to her very good to be on Appleseed Farm. And of course, the last sketch shows of all the goodness that comes from the apples. And that ends that book, second graders. I hope you enjoyed that. Like I said, when I was a young girl about your age, I really enjoyed my teacher reading this book to me. I lived in that area at that time and had learned about Johnny Appleseed myself and just knew that he was a really good man who cared about others. Hopefully, it inspires you a little bit to care about the others that are around you, especially during this time of quarantine when we are together so close as families. Work together with your family, love them, show kindness to them. That's what Johnny Appleseed would have wanted.